What's up, OUXers? If you have been in any of my presentations or workshops, you probably know how much I quote Andrew Hinton and recommend his book. So this interview is one that I've been waiting for a while. The book that I refer to, Understanding Context, is probably the only professional book that I've read 3 times. And it's definitely the only O'Reilly book that I've read 3 times. And the last time I read it, that time through was actually with the OUX book club. And that was the only book club that we met more than once for. We actually met 3 times for this book because after the first meeting, we were like, we've got to break this up. So it is an understatement to say that I love this book. And Andrew himself has been a mentor and a supporter of my work for years. So when he moved back home to Atlanta after helping grow the Understanding Group, or TUG as you might know it, one of the most influential information architecture firms in the world, he was kind enough to meet me for drinks back in 2015. I was just getting started on my OUX journey and actually reading Understanding Context for the first time. So he was very nice to let me buy him drinks and ask him all the questions that I had about the book, at least in that first reading. Since then, Andrew has spoken at the conference that I founded, the UX Hustle Summit. He spoke at that twice. We've continued to cross paths at Atlanta meetups, at Atlanta World IA Day. In fact, actually, the last time I saw him in person was at World IA Day 2020, which was just about a week, maybe 2 weeks, I think just 1 week before the pandemic shut down. And it was the last large gathering that either of us have been to in really over a year now. But this conversation is by far the most in-depth we've gotten on the philosophy of embodied cognition. It's a longer conversation, and we definitely could have gone on for hours, but we need to just go ahead and jump into it. So let me introduce you to Andrew. So he is currently a senior manager of design strategy and research at Honeywell. And previously, he was senior architect at State Farm. And of course, before that, he was with the Understanding Group as an information architect there. He is a seasoned public speaker, having graced the stage of the IA conference, UX Lisbon, UX Week, and about 7 or 8 speaking appearances at IA Summit. Okay, so lean back, get ready, strap in, and let's jump into it. Welcome to the Object-Oriented UX podcast, a podcast about tackling complexity head-on, gracefully organizing massive amounts of information, and designing scalable, future-proof, and of course, naturally intuitive object-oriented user experiences. An OUXer is a powerful blend of information architect, business analyst, facilitator, and UX strategist. If this sounds like you or what you aspire to, you are so in the right place. I'm Sophia Prater, UX designer, chief evangelist of Object-Oriented UX, and your host. Let's jump into it. Andrew Hinton, welcome to the Object-Oriented UX podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so good. It's so good to have you. So my first question for you, we're just going to go, I want to get a little bit into your backstory. So I know from your book that, and also just from knowing you and from previous conversations that you kind of got interested in object-oriented UX. You got interested in information architecture while playing Dungeons and Dragons and Quake and some other really geeky games. Can you talk a little bit about how that got you interested in IA?
Yeah. Well, so it's more like, I mean, when I was doing those things, IA wasn't a thing yet, really. At least not the web version. I mean, Richard Saul Ruhrmann had coined the term in another whole context back in the mid 70s, but I wasn't aware of it. But as a kid, I was always really interested in. I got really interested in Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, as a preteen, early teen, and kind of the first wave of that. And I always had a lot of fun with making my own. I didn't like buying other people's, or probably because they were expensive, and I was a kid, right? So you go buy like a dungeon to do with your friends, and it was like another $8 or $10, and in 1980 that was a lot of money for a 12 or 13-year-old. So Plus, I didn't have the patience to read all that material. So, so I just like to get out graph paper and make my own things, and that and some other things that my friends did. Like I remember like my friend Wayne down the street from me was a big baseball fan. I wasn't particularly, but we made together like a dice rolling game based on baseball, just something to do. So like making the things that people do things with or in was kind of an early interest. And then like later on, like in my early 20s, late teen or early 20s, when I first really encountered the internet, quote unquote. And this is pre-web, or at least graphical web. Just being online, or even before that, when I first got a modem and I dialed into like BBSs, like bulletin board systems, where people were like running it from their house, just a computer with an extra phone line, and just the fact that like I was in these places that felt like places, but they were just command line words, and then it felt like space, and there was a chat room for this, but you go to this, or some of them were like adventures, where you would, like go north, south, east, or west, like those word-based adventure games. All of those things, and then eventually getting into it won't go into my whole sorted, varied career paths, but when I finally ended up landing almost accidentally in the world of like doing things on the internet for a living, and taking my writing background into that career path, and realizing that like, wait, when I'm making these web pages, I'm not just a copywriter, like I'm doing something more than that, because I'm creating links to things. And creating these structures, right, that people are in together and doing things in together. And in between that and like experiencing like multi-user dungeons or mushes, things like that were just these text-based like shared digital environments that have been around for years. All of that was just fascinating to me, and I always found myself on the making the places side of it, being more interested in that than actually just experiencing them. So all of that kind of added up to, by the time I was doing this for a living, it all kind of started coming together, and I'm like, hey, when I'm making these websites, I'm doing something very similar to these things I've done in the past.
That's so interesting. So I also, as a kid, like what I did for fun. It's a great question to be asking for anybody out there that is questioning your career path. Like, go back to like, what did you do for fun as a kid? And I would make my own games as well. I would create my own card games. I would create my own experiences. I would actually design like summer camps, and I would write agendas for summer camps. Like what is going to be for breakfast on these different days? Like I would design, but I wasn't really interested in going to summer camps. I just wanted to design them. But I was also
that's great.
I was designing games. I was designing my own toys. I was designing games for the neighborhood kids as well. Like I didn't want to play capture the flag. I wanted to make up a game and tell everybody how to play it. But it never even occurred to me to become a game designer. Now, like one of the most interesting, or like one of the most things that has been the most fun for me, like in the past few years, was designing Crosslinked, which is a game to help you learn object-oriented UX. I had so much fun working on that. And I want to design another game. Like there's a board game. I know I can like create some sort of crazy board game. But I'm not a game designer. So like, what do you think separates people because I'm sure game designers, they were designing games as well when they were kids. And some people kind of go in this UX IA direction. And some people will go in a game design direction. Like, can you think of like, what's the difference?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I was interested in game design years ago, but it seemed like such a fanciful thing to be interested in doing. I mean, like digital game design, at the time, and then sure enough, it turned into major industry, et cetera. But so I guess I'm just saying there wasn't like a path that was obvious to me to go, oh, I want to go do that for a living. Like what I do for a living. I mean, I ended up. Doing things on the web was more of a hobby for me all through grad school, two grad schools, while I was doing literature and creative writing and stuff like that. I was convinced, you know, I was going to go be a professor and I was going to write poems and stories, and that was going to be my thing. That turned into kind of flipping, and that path ended up not really being very workable for me. But I was able to get a job doing, quote, technical writing at the registrar's office at the university I graduated from for my second MFA degree. So anyway, long story short, I mean, I kind of stumbled into it. So I don't know. I mean, I guess to me, that's why I took that path. Now, like my daughter, for example, I mean, she's a really talented graphical artist, a creative artist with visual arts. And she ended up going to SCAD in Atlanta. And originally she was interested in the game design program, but ended up really moving more toward animation because all the things that she would want to do in a game were more in the animation track, rather than the engineering or game mechanics kind of logic of game making, which she's interested in, but it just, you know, so I don't know. I think it's just life circumstances. Probably you just end up kind of bouncing into one direction or the other.
Yeah. And if you think about like even my process for designing a game, it's more about designing the components of the game and then like figuring out and then maybe like come up with some game mechanics to use those components, like saying, okay, here's these cards and they're going to have like I like probably if you gave me a deck of baseball cards and some dice, I would be really interested because, but I would be like reverse engineering those baseball cards to be like, okay, what are the different components? What's the metadata on these and how do I tie?
What can we do with these?
Yeah. What can we do with this?
How do they? Yeah.
Anyway,
Cool.
let's get into some of these harder questions. All right. So
okay.
Can you explain?
Bring it on.
Can you explain to me and to everybody listening embodied cognition, please? And also, like, why is it important for UX designers to understand the concept of embodied cognition?
Yeah. So let me explain a little bit why I got into that as a thing. I'd heard the phrase years back, and it rung a bell because it does sound like an oxymoron in some ways, right? In our Western way of thinking about cognition and the brain or thinking, the mind, there's this mind-body duality. But it was intriguing to me because, again, like I had experienced the fact that like I could be personal, like my life could feel different. I could discover things about myself. Things could change in my real physical life because of the places that existed online, you know, and they were impacting me in ways in my life more so, or at least the same as physical interactions with people, right? So this idea that like there's some embodied or something about the body involved in all these things that are actually very disembodied, like that was interesting to me in the work that I was doing already. But then what drew me to information architecture as a community and as a field was again the thing we talked about earlier, this feeling that like I feel like I'm involved in making something out of this information, these places, and it's architectural, but is it really just a metaphor or is it more than that? And it was really through unpacking that and kind of teasing apart the pieces of that led me to wanting to write the book, because the book was, I finally realized, like, look, if I'm asking the question, what is it as an information architect that I'm architecting with information? You know, what does it mean to do that? Like materially, what does it mean? And the thing I ended up kind of, you know, hitting upon is, well, the one reductive like thing that we're really working with here is context, that where something is and how it relates to something else, or what a place is and how the arrangement of those places create some kind of whole or a system, how that affects human behavior, the way that people get channeled through structures to do things, whether they're socializing or doing work or buying something. There's got to be, it's kind of like we understand how clay works to make pots. We understand how steel works to make, cutlery. There's properties to the materials, and the craftspeople that you go to school or apprenticeships and you learn these properties. What are the properties of the material we use in relation to us? And I didn't see that being explained anywhere, figured out anywhere. So Okay, so that ended up leading me into exploring that as one. I thought it was going to be one topic or one subtopic of this book I was going to try to write about context. And then when I got to the part, like while I was writing all this, I got a couple of like 150 pages together of the sort of essay type material, and I was like, well, I need to start diving in. I need to explain what information is in this thing, because it's, I keep referring to information. So I started asking people I knew who were experts in that question, and I never could get a straight answer. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Because it all depended, right? It was like, well, information in this context means this, and then this means this, and this means this. But I've been following some people online on Twitter who were these academics doing like actual psychological science and experimentation around what they were calling embodied cognition, and I asked them, like, well, what is information? I saw some stuff that was using the word information in an interesting way, and I was like, what is that to you? And they pointed me to James J. Gibson's work, and then I started diving into that and other related materials around embodied cognition or ecological psychology and related theories. And I just went really deep. I mean, it ended up blowing up everything I was doing with a book and rewired my whole head. So that was kind of how I got into it. Embodied cognition, basically, and again, there's different flavors of under that label. Okay, the school of thought that I have found myself believing in and following on this is what's called kind of the radical hypothesis, meaning radical meaning at the root. Like basically it's like you got to tear the roots up on how we think about cognition and kind of flip it and start over. Cognition as it is currently in the mainstream really understood comes from early to mid 20th century cognitive science, which really started coming into its own around the same time that digital technology was digital theory, information theory was starting to kind of come to the fore in computing. And what happened really was, and this is a broad brush, but what really happened was, like, psychologists were like, well, right now what we've got is a Skinner-based model. We're just watching creatures do things and trying to infer what's happening, but we don't know what's going on inside their brain, right? And the Skinner perspective and those like it were very empirical. They're like, all we know is what we see. We can't make inferences about what their logic is or what's going on inside the head. But suddenly now we had a way to think about it, because, well, we see how computers work. And so it gave us a framework for, brains work that way too, right? You've got sensory mechanisms that are taking in information from the environment, and then it's processing it in some kind of logical way. And then it's telling the body, now go do this in response to what we've sensed, right? Embodied cognition flips that and says, cognition actually starts in the environment. Because we evolved in an environment, right? So we still are, everything we do now as human beings is sitting on top of wetware and hardware that goes all the way back to like tadpoles. And and we see these very simple creatures in our environments doing extremely complex things. And how is that happening when there's barely a brain to speak of? In my book, I even went further and I said, if you just look at a Venus flytrap, right? It exhibits what seems to be fairly sophisticated logical behavior, right? It just sits there, but then when an insect hits one of the little hairs in its petals, it closes up, but it doesn't do it right away. There's a sort of a timer where it seems to know not to close on things that might not actually be food, right? Well, of course, that evolved that way. I mean, nobody programmed it. I mean, it's just the plants that survived happen to be able to do that. But like, okay, well, yeah, that's a very simple thing. But what if you connected that? We know now that a lot of the way emergent complexity happens is you take very simple rules and you plug them in together, and you can have just a handful of simple rules that can end up exhibiting extremely complex behavior, like ants colonies, like bird flocking. So I brought as an example to be like, look, imagine a million of those all doing very simple things together, and then suddenly you end up with a brain. but it's not in a vat by itself. It's connected to an environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing what it's doing because an environment is functioning a certain way, and it fits a nested set of mechanics that are happening in an ecosystem. We're a part of that ecosystem,
Yeah.
even though we like to think of ourselves as outside of it.
We are here in the way that we're here because of the way that our environment is.
Yeah, and so we're shaped in the way we think and act and behave and comprehend our environment, emerge from our intrinsic and inextricable relationship with our environment, right? So embodied cognition just basically says, look, the brain is important, but it is a facilitator, it is a supplement, right? It's an augmenter.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the source and an encapsulation of what we think of as cognition. That so when we think through things, we're thinking through things and using our environment in ways that we're not always even aware of,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even when we're reading written language, our bodies and brains, I say bodies because I include brain, but are silently sounding the words out to ourselves. I mean, they've done like MRI studies and stuff to show that like your brain is essentially doing the same things that it does if you're reading aloud, but we've just learned to internalize it and kind of hear it in our heads, and it's become so kind of background, right? There's all kinds of things we do that are like using, organizing your mail. Like you get your mail and you're like, okay, well, this is the junk. I'm going to put it over here, and this is over here, and this is over here. You use space to think through what you're doing. And we do it so naturally every day. We're like fish in water. We just don't realize that we're swimming, but we are inextricably using our environment to think all the time.
So, okay. So going off script just a little bit, because I do want to bring in some of the conversations that my dad and I have been having about this.
Sure.
So what though, would you say separates us from the bee doing its dance? And the bee, bees have their very complex dances, just like the Venus flytrap has its very complex procedures that it runs pretty much. And like the bee, they have like so much communication happens in just the way that the bee is dancing and they're talking to the other bees, right? What separates us? Are we just doing that, even more and more complexly than what the bees are doing it? Or is there something fundamental? And I want to hear what your answer is. I have my answer.
But... I mean, to me, I guess where I've landed is the distinctions between all this have more to do with continuums than binaries. So it's not like, I don't think that there's some fundamental like, oh, there's like a God stone or something, I know that's ridiculous, but I'm saying like, there's no like thing that we have that fundamentally in some very categorical, very clear red line difference separates us from what we think of as animals in the world. And again, this is just based on the research I did for the book and the reading. I'm as a total amateur on all this, but what we did do was somewhere along the way, our particular branch of primates started developing language.
Yes.
In a way that is more reliant on symbolism and a whole other semiotic lattice work, right? That means language for us. That's very different from even very advanced primates who, or even dogs or other dolphins, right? Other pretty capable creatures that can learn words as sort of signifiers and things like that, right? It can get pretty sophisticated. But for them, it's more, the semiotics are different, right? They're not, they're more like a direct referent to, okay, they've learned an association between this thing and this thing, and then they have to kind of generalize it. The way we use that is a whole other category up, where our linguistic system is super complex and kind of very self-referential, right? So we've got words that wouldn't exist if it was only about object word or action word. It's words that are defined that way because of other words, like they're just on top of each other, right? Like layers. Right. So and again, because all that comes very naturally to us. There's one book I reference a lot called The Symbolic Species, which I think is a great way of talking about humans, that symbolism has become so core to the way we our civilization and everything else, that we just sort of take it for granted, right? But I think language is the way we use what we think of as language, I think is the key difference.
I think that's the Godstone. That's it.
That we've built everything you see around us that goes, oh, that's human, or that's quote artificial, right? Like you see beavers build dams. We don't call those artificial, we call them natural.
Right.
We say artificial because humans made something that didn't exist already. All that stuff happened because of language. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't have that ability to communicate in that way.
Specifically, that language being, I'm going to say it, object oriented, or being able to take a concept. So instead of, and I think that even as potentially even other humanoid sapien species, Neanderthals, potentially other species that did not quite make it, also maybe when they were speaking procedurally. So that you would have, just like the bee dance, you would have like a series of sounds that would mean, something in the environment is happening. But when potentially you have, and this is the example, I'm totally stealing off my dad's example. When you have two sisters, and one of them says, "What's that?" And the other one says, "Apple." And now you have, or they say, the one sister sees the apple, says apple to the other sister, and the other sister has a picture of an apple in her head. And so you can take from the physical environment a concept, turn it into language, and actually create a picture in somebody else's head. And now you have modular language. You can now have concepts that you can manipulate versus just like more and more complex strings of information.
Yeah. I follow what you're saying there. And overall, but I think that the concept you're saying, yes, I'm in line with that. And not to nitpick too much, I'm just going to mention a couple things. So one, interestingly enough, like just just like yesterday, no, it's fine. Just like yesterday, I ran across something where a woman has written like there's a whole book about the handshake, and there's all this evidence that shows that like even Neanderthals had like the handshake as a thing, that handshaking among hominids is like really ancient. Well, like you think about that's a linguistic thing to do, meaning you do it because it means something outside of only itself, right? You don't just shake somebody's hand because I'm holding a hand. Well, it's not doing anything necessarily physically in the moment. It's now I don't know. I haven't read that much of her stuff, so I don't really know that much about it. But that registered with me because, and that book I mentioned, Symbolic Species, which some of this is not, again, a lot of this I'm talking about is certainly not like mainstream, like conventional wisdom or whatever. But like he talks about how there's evidence of language, and not just him. There have been other things from like anthropology coming out in recent years saying that like, hey, they found tools that are sophisticated enough from hundreds of thousands of years ago that they just can't come up with how that tool could have been recreated in different places, the evidence of the same tooling in different places, that it would have required a kind of communication that goes beyond merely point and grunt. You know what I mean? And now, of course, we've all grown up reading and writing. And so we think of language as a lot of it is bound up in how we think of writing. But that is just a blip in human history that we've written things down. But verbal communication among hominids goes back way, and even Homo sapiens goes back way further than that, right? So part of what I get into in the book is the fact that like what I try to do is I try to start off with cognition and what that means, what the perception action loop is, things like that for like spiders and lizards, not humans yet. But then we get into language. We're like, but now humans added this whole other set of environmental stuff on top of everything else that we treat almost like objects and things in our world, but they don't behave in quite the same way, right? Because they're not. You can say the same word and it can mean three different things. I can say Apple, or are you talking about, the maker of my iPhone? Or are you talking about a crab apple, or, you know, I don't know. There's other ways to use the word apple, I know, but so anyway, there's that. And even just the way language works, when you're doing information architecture, like, and you start going deep on, well, how do categories be categories, and how is it that we can say something is a tree, like, when, well, there's so many different shapes of trees, like, how is that a word, right, that we know what it means? And that goes back, I mean, centuries, you know, like, there's the whole idea of the Platonic ideal from Plato, like, is all wrapped up in this idea that when you say bird, there's some Platonic ideal of bird, but we don't get to experience it, but we have it in our heads somehow, which contributes, by the way, to this whole body-mind duality problem. But regardless, I'm getting off base here, but just there's a lot to understanding the way a word comes to mean something in a community. And the truth is, almost nobody learns what it means just in a sort of like, I see an object and I've learned that this is this. It's like you grow up as an infant and you see people around you speaking and doing things, and you just start absorbing all of that, being immersed in it. But then eventually it starts to be more formalized, right? Especially in our modern life. And so language really emerges in a very messy, overlappy, not very well, the edges are not well defined, right? In the way that language happens, the way it emerges over time. But then what we do is we come in and we bring a grid and put over it, and we go, well, we got to start defining what these things are so we're all on the same page, right? And so we create these artificial systems that make it more modular. So like when we learn in school about the parts of speech, noun, verb, adjective, well, sentences didn't start because somebody came up with that framework. It's a descriptive framework to describe the structures that emerge.
Right.
So I'm bringing that up because it's important, because it makes a big difference between the systems we make, even in digital design, are really these artificial constructs that can never quite mirror the organic kind of richness and nuance of the way these things actually are used and the way they emerge in daily life, right? So what we have to do is create these constructs that define things in certain ways for certain purposes, so that we've got like a controlled vocabulary for manufacturing and another one for medical science, you know, and things like that, or a dictionary.
So one thing I just have to say for the record is hominid was the word that I was looking for. I think I said humanoid.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
I think that's like my UFO brain saying my interest in aliens totally came in and I said humanoid, but hominid was the word. But my other, like, I guess kind of question from all that is that, so because we are these embodied creatures that we are the way we have been shaped by our environment, we are the way we are because of this environment that we've evolved in. Now we're spending so much of our time in these digital environments that have evolved very, very quickly, and they have not necessarily evolved in a way that that we can be embodied in the way that we are embodied in our physical environment, because that happened over, you know, hundreds of thousands of years versus the last century. And then, you know, the environments that we're in now are designed by a certain set of people for certain motivations that are different than the way that our physical environment was quote unquote designed in. So as designers of these digital spaces, we are not beholden to the laws of physics. Right. The way that the physical environment is beholden to the laws of physics. And we expect, to kind of quote your book here, if I can find it. Have you noticed that when we use software, our perception seems to expect that environment to behave according to the same laws we rely on in the physical world? Yet then we go into these digital environments and we create these crazy fun houses that confuse the hell out of people, because we're designing in pixels now and ones and zeros, and we are completely detached from the physical environment. That's kind of a good thing though, because that's the whole point of technology, is to turn us into superheroes, to give us superpowers. So how do we know, like, when to, as digital designers, when do we follow the laws of physics to reflect, you know, that embodied cognition, and when do we break them?
Yeah, so the superpower thing, and you had mentioned that in your earlier notes to me, and I thought that was an interesting way to put that. Yeah, digital information and digital technology gives us these amazing abilities that we didn't have otherwise. And so very very straightforward example, like for example, email,
Mm-hmm.
right? So and this is like pre-web. I mean, physical mail has certain limitations to it because you know our even as advanced as we've been in our history in terms of like writing down our language, encoding speech. Basically, what writing is you're encoding speech into marks that then someone has been taught how to look at and hear the sounds in their heads to go, oh, I now know what I'm reading, right? And so you're freeze drying your verbal into something that then somebody else can thaw and interpret in their heads,
Yeah.
right? So that was amazing, but it was still embodied in the medium. So like, if you wanted to send a letter to 20 people, you had to print 20 letters, you had to type 20 letters
Mm-hmm.
or write out 20 times or 20 copies of a book or whatever, right? And now what they did was, the email was basically, okay, let's use the tropes, the metaphors of mail, but let's dematerialize it and turn it into things that we now have an inbox, but it behaves not quite the same as like a mailbox.
Yeah,
I
in
mean, a
one way,
mailbox can only,
yeah, in one way, it's infinite, right?
yeah, you can only fit so much mail in my box. So now there's a problem. Also, you can only send me so many things if you have to write them down and put them a
Uh,
postage and send it. Right now, I can I can email a million people almost without effort, and now they have to do work to figure out what to do in
mm-hmm.
response, right? So we've introduced these wildly disproportionate dynamics into our lives because we've detached so much of what we do as humans from the inertia that came with it having to be attached to some physical medium.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, but email gives us superpowers too, right? I can immediately send something to somebody around the world and they can send me a response. Even this conversation we're having right now is many miles away from each other. It's disembodied, but it enables us to do this super thing. And the thing is though, that like if Superman, for example, like, yeah, he's got supervision and he's got like heat vision, but like he needs to learn how to use that properly.
Mm-hmm.
It's not inherently good, right? He needs to learn how to not burn things down with it that he doesn't want to burn down.
Yeah.
So that's my point with all this is we've sort of been in this Wild West period where we just sort of create new things with digital using assumptions and patterns that we've sort of borrowed from our physical lives and our human civilization lives that were more tethered to physical things. And we're like, well, but now it's that plus it's even better now, right? But we've tended to kind of shift under the rug like the negatives. And I think when I was writing my book, like I was bringing a lot of these things up, and I was trying to be very careful not to be an alarmist because I myself didn't appreciate some of the people in the world being more alarmist about these things. Oh my God, end of the world because filter bubbles or what have you. Now I'm realizing like I was too cautious because over the last few years we've seen like how all this digital technology is really causing it's playing such a role and it's enabling some really awful things to happen
Mm-hmm.
because we weren't thinking about how taking away the limitations of physical mechanics and rules can just allow all this stuff to come converging and crashing together in ways that really screws stuff up, right? So now anybody can, like it used to be, you knew if news was somewhat trustworthy because if there was enough money behind it to be like a real newspaper and you saw it all around you in the city, it was sort of trusted, right, to a degree. Now we can mimic the the aesthetics and the posture of legitimate media, but it can just be some wild-haired rabble rouser in their garage with a green screen,
Mm-hmm.
broadcasting as if they're CNN.
Yeah.
And you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And even like there's like radical groups that have been like standing up like what looked like no local newspapers all over the United States online, as local news divisions are dying off because of digitization, and then people are going to these things thinking, oh, this is news for my town, but really it's propaganda. But it looks like legitimate
That's
news.
so
So it's things
interesting.
like that are just endless issues like that we're running into now.
And that's actually, I mean, totally takes the conversation to a different turn. Because when I was thinking about confusing people, I was thinking like just, confusing people in the way that like, oh, the back button doesn't actually go back anymore. Like things where,
Well, but that
just
too,
like from an
right?
intuitive UX perspective, it confuses people. But you're bringing on like a much bigger issue here of ethics of like what, we are now, we are finite embodied creatures who now have infinite inboxes, and I have the same capacity to process information pretty much that
Mm-hmm.
I did 20 years ago or that my counterpart did 100 years ago, yet now I have
Mm-hmm.
these infinite inboxes and I'm still sort of expected to get to the bottom of them. That
Mm-hmm.
just being one issue. So now we have an embodied physical creature working in these digital environments that have these, like what I think you said, like just like the basically like the weighting is off, right?
Yeah. You become it can become wildly disproportionate.
Disproportionate, yeah.
An act can have a wildly disproportionate effect,
Mm-hmm.
because it's untethered from the limitations of what physical media used to. Still, I mean, I've got a pile of mail here I haven't gone through yet. But to your point though, like, so that bigger issue, that bigger ecosystem problem it's fractal all the way down, because it's down to the level of what does this button really mean, right? So in the same way that what does it mean if I'm reading this newspaper, I'm assuming it means that this is legitimate news. Well, if I'm using something like Facebook, right? So like Facebook early on, it really built its business on lying to people, by playing with context. So I remember like in like 2007 or 8 or whatever, when it was first really growing by leaps and bounds, you would get a notification that like Sophia just invited you to play this game or whatever, and it sounded as if you sat down and said, I like Andrew. I think Andrew's going to really like this game. I'm going to invite him. But really, all it was it had popped something up in front of you that was kind of hard to understand in the moment, that you ended up saying yes to. And what it really did was it invited your entire friends list to play that game,
Mm-hmm.
right? So one, it tricked you. You didn't even realize it was necessarily doing that. And then two, it tricked me into thinking that, oh, I've personally been reached out to engage on something. When really it was tricking our wetware a little bit
Mm-hmm.
in order to grow, right? And now, I mean, and Facebook used to get in trouble for some of the things it was doing with our information, how it would track what we were doing. And so I bring up the Facebook beacon example in the book, which is a very early example of this, where they could get away with tracking what you were buying outside of Facebook, right? Things that you were doing online, they could get away with that in a way that they could not have gotten away with in a physical, like pre-internet place. I used to do a talk where I would talk about how, like, imagine if you're in Vegas and they're using cameras everywhere and they know everything you've bought at every place, and they're using all that information then to market other things to you, right? Even if you're only at one casino, all the other casinos have bought that information. There would be a hue and a cry. There would have to be laws created. There have to be
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure created to track people to that degree, which is increasingly surveillance. Stuff is increasingly a thing. Did online digital, like, just it took away the physical constraints,
Yeah.
right? And then it gave this playground for them to try all this stuff. And now it's really turned to their whole business model. And where the front room that we're actually doing the things in, the value we get out of Facebook, which is the social connection and planning and all that, that's not really the purpose of Facebook. The purpose of Facebook is to use all that information to give to people to market things to us.
So if we like boil this down to kind of like what should UX designers watch out for? So to summarize and tell me like what you would add to this is or how you would shift this is we need to recognize when we're breaking the laws of physics. We need to remember that we are physical creatures. Recognize, okay, this thing that we're doing with that I'm doing with my company, that I'm doing with the digital environment that I'm creating, I am breaking the laws of physics. What is the motivation for this? Is it the motivation for the company? Is it a motivation to make this person super powered? And what are the repercussions of making them super powered? So we need to like take it an extra step and say, okay, well, we've created an infinite inbox. Isn't that great that we've created an infinite inbox? But wait a second, what is that? What is that actually going to do to this human being that has a finite capacity? So
yeah, like one example I bring up a lot is reply all on email, which is a very early problem, right? Usability problem. And again, it's a thing where if I replied, one, having multiple people on one message in that way wouldn't have existed without email. I mean, I could send the same letter to 10 people, but there's no way then for one of them to accidentally send their response to all the other 10 people, unless they really work hard at it. Whereas it's just a matter of accidentally clicking the wrong button in an email app. And it's interesting how, I mean, it's a good example because it's sort of like, well, we just mimicked a lot of what we do in real life, and then we added some superpowers to it, right? When email was invented. But the assumption was that all the stuff that we borrowed from in terms of the way regular mail works was just going to work out fine, and then we're just adding some superpowers. It's all gravy now, right? Only to realize, oh my gosh, we have this problem that we keep doing. I accidentally replied all. And so it took years, but finally, like email client applications started building in some protections against that to try to like, are you sure you want to send a reply all, or it hides the CC line, you have to really decide, I'm going to do that. It adds inertia, right, to it. It's not the same inertia that we have in the physical mail world, but it does the job. So that's an example to answer what your question is, right? It's like not having to, I mean, the internet is not bound by physics in quite the same ways. I have to mention though that it is, in the sense that we still have to power enormous server farms and technology around the world that does have impacts on our physical life. That's something we shouldn't forget. The cloud is not a cloud. It's a lot of very solid things eating a lot of power.
Right.
But setting that aside, that's really what the book ends up getting into is those are the decisions we have to make. We have to think about how is what is this environment I'm making? What parts is it made of? What is the behavior of those parts? How do those parts signify to the user the nature of those parts and what they're going to do? A hammer is very clear. I can pick up a hammer. It's heavy. I know what it's going to do if I hit something with it, even if I'd never seen a hammer before. Not so with anything we put on screens, because all of that is simulating objects. It's simulating physical things in a lot of ways that we interact with. But it means we can change the rules of what those things mean and what cause and effect means with just a code update. So how do we make sure that we give people all the benefits of the superpowers, but we still give them enough consistency and coherence with the way their environment works that they can comprehend it and learn it and not do something in one part of it that have a totally different impact than some other part of it, that sometimes in ways that they're not even going to get to see, or they don't even know what's happening, right? So on Facebook, if I click like on something, I just want that person to know I liked their thing. But Facebook's algorithm is tracking that and trying to figure out, what else does Andrew like, right? And then I'm having to second guess, like, well, shit, do I really want to click this thing? Because I don't want to like this, because the system might start sending me more ads about that. And you know what I mean? And so it gets really convoluted, because I don't know what the person behind the curtain, this algorithm, is doing with the information.
Yeah, it's those hidden rules that you talk about, and that I talk about a lot too, about how do we communicate those hidden rules. Hey y'all, just a quick interruption. As of this recording, we are in the midst of cohort 4 of the OUX certification, and enrollment for cohort 5 won't open up until early summer 2021. But you can dig into all the certification video content, all the templates, all the resources by grabbing access to the OUX Masterclass. And if, after going through the masterclass, you want to get certified, you'll be able to apply the cost of the masterclass to your enrollment in cohort 5. So you can kind of think about it like a down payment. Once you enroll in the masterclass, you'll get access to the OUX Academy, and over the course of 10 weeks, about 2 to 3 hours of video lectures will be released to you each week. But you can consume that content totally at your own pace. You'll have lifetime access to it. So if it takes you 20 weeks to go through it, that's totally fine. You're not just gonna get video content. You're gonna get checklists. You're gonna get exercises. You're gonna get assignments and tons of valuable resources. Basically everything you need to become an expert complexity wrangler. Again, you get everything that a certification cohort gets, just minus all those personal touches. The camaraderie of the cohort in the OUX forum, access to the OUX mentors, the one-on-ones with me, as well as me answering all your questions in the forum and in office hours, and of course the actual certification and a profile on OUX.com. So for all of that, you'll need to actually join a cohort. But you don't have to wait. You can start becoming that complexity wrangling, stakeholder whispering, IA facilitator extraordinaire now. You can start saving yourself and your team countless hours of rework. And you can start saving your user from the extraneous complexity that OUX helps you avoid. So go to OUX.com/certification to learn more. From there, you can get on the wait list for cohort 5, as well as get yourself access to that entire video library that is the OUX Masterclass. Still not sure if you're ready to take the plunge? Go check out the testimonials on OUX.com. Okay, back to the show. Okay, so let's get into the hidden rules, and then we can kind of like go back to the question that I have on place versus object. So, but this is one of the things that I kind of wanted to get your perspective on. It's sort of like context versus consistency conversation. So. One thing that we talk a lot about in object-oriented UX is shapeshifters. So shapeshifter is basically an object that changes shape, like basically changes its outfit arbitrarily from one screen to another screen. And we can probably both agree that that's bad. So like
changes the way it looks
and potentially the structure,
what it means.
So like a great Meetup is an example that I give all the time. So there's an event object on Meetup. It's the object on Meetup. You got events and you got people, and you can look at, there's at least 5 different representations of the event object depending on where you're looking at it, and things change arbitrarily. So for example, even like the RSVP indication. So sometimes it'll be like a little green check mark and it'll say yes. And then another place it'll say I'm going. In a different place, the date changes around, the hierarchy changes around. So like the actual attributes change structure. So the way that I teach this is that's bad for multiple reasons. And you know why this happens is we're designing page by page. And we're designing these pages in isolation and not thinking about these things as a whole, or like, so it might be the same designer designing these screens 2 months apart and they're not referencing the other screen, or it's 2 different designers because you got a designer on the calendar page and you've got a designer on the group page, and the event shows on both those pages, but those designers aren't talking to each other. So what you get is you get all these arbitrary changes. So you do double work as a designer. The developer now has to do double work. And now the user actually has to do more. There's extraneous complexity as far as cognitive load, because now they're having to find things in different places. So arbitrary change, bad. Now, one of the big questions that I get is, what if you're changing things around intentionally? Because over here, price is more important over here. So we're going to move price up and put it in red. The date and time is more important in calendar. So we're going to put it at the top and we're going to put it in bigger text. And then over here, the date and time is going to be in light gray text. And usually my answer for that is, well, be super intentional about it, but also be conservative and realize you're sacrificing consistency. when you're moving things
Mm-hmm.
around. So even though it's more important and you put it unread at the top, the user still might not see it because they're expecting it. They've like already sort of been trained to look for
Right.
that piece of information in another place. So my question for you is, it gets into these hidden rules. So when you do start changing things around, so let's say I have an article object, and some article objects just kind of show, like you got a title, you got the timestamp, and you've got the little blurb and maybe the author on there. But then other
Mm-hmm.
articles show bigger, and there's a big join the conversation button. All right. So now there might be some
Yeah.
hidden rules behind that, but then the user doesn't know, like, why does this look different? Because in the wild, when two things look different, there's usually a very good reason. So when two things look different, we're going to start trying to attribute meaning to that difference. And then we
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily, if the meaning isn't communicated to us, like if join
Right.
the conversation button there and it's big because it's the more popular article, or because it's recommended to me, or because maybe some algorithm has decided it's more controversial, so more people should be talking
Mm-hmm.
about it. How do we communicate those? And I want to hear any thoughts you have on shapeshifters, but and like designing for context versus consistency, but specifically like if there's hidden rules that change the shape of something, how much do we need to communicate that, and how do we kind of balance that with like cluttering up the interface by saying like, this is why you're seeing this here?
Yeah. So the distinction I make is consistency versus coherence, and meaning consistency. And again, these are words that can mean a lot of different things, but I think generally speaking that this is at the core of what those words mean. It makes them a little different. Consistency is usually we mean that by in terms of kind of a surface consistency, right? Like all these things are the same size, or well, the same in digital screen design. It's like, well, are we using the same rounded corners across everything? Are we using the same? Are we saying log on here and log in over there? No, we should just choose one, right? So there's a lot of things that are just based on surface consistency. We're doing pretty good work in terms of coherence. If I've got log on here and log in over there, it's pretty clear. We just pick one. And so we're not making people think, wait, is log on something different from log in? Great. Consistency gave us coherence. Okay. But sometimes the thing is, all those things don't exist in a vacuum, right? They mean something because of you're experiencing a relation with other things. And this is how language works too. So like I said, it's funny on an iOS device, when you're trying to type certain things like the word Apple, it just wants to capitalize it all the time because it's an Apple device. But sometimes I'm like, no, I really am just talking about buying some Honey Crisps. So Siri, you can just back off.
You should try those Cosmic Crisps. Cosmic Crisps are, yeah.
I haven't tried those yet. Anyway, but you see what I mean, though, is like, so in the things, this is why I keep coming back to the fact that when we're putting these things on screens, we're not putting real objects on screens. We are simulating an environment. This is why the word affordance becomes tricky, because, and that's a whole other conversation, but affordance is really about physical interaction, perception and action. But what information are we giving people, and what does it mean in relation to the other information around it? Because the ideal would be that where we have inconsistency, we're doing it because we're making it more coherent, right? But the only way we know that is by really understanding the human creature and how they're interacting with this environment that we're making. What is it meaning to them? And that ends up getting into some of the other things that you mentioned we want to talk about. But here's the thing: is there is no decision tree or rule matrix for us to follow on all this. It really comes down to there's a creature who's trying to perceive and act in an environment that we're putting in front of them, and how is all of that converging? All of those moving parts that we've created, how are they all converging in that moment for that person, traversing different parts, touch points within that environmental context? What is it meaning to them, right? Like, this goes way back. I remember many years ago, and I'll stop with this little anecdote. When Amazon was still kind of a new thing, And this is like circa 2000 or so. And I remember that in the IA community, there was sort of a hue and a cry because they used one of their tabs. And I think it was like the Xbox was new or something. They used one of their tabs specifically for like a particular specific product,
Oh,
right?
instead of going to some sort
And
of
it was like,
list or
wait, that's
category.
not, that's wrong. That's further down in the tree. Like, well, how could they do this? This is bad. But it was like, but wait a minute, it's working for them because people want Xboxes or whatever the thing was. And there it is right there. As soon as you land on the homepage, they're getting people to the thing that not everybody realized they could even get at Amazon at the time. You know what I mean? Like it worked. It wasn't consistent with their hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
but it did the job it needed to do for coherence for the context that they were in. And actual end users weren't complaining. It worked for them,
Yeah.
So like that's really what it comes down to, right? Is sometimes it makes more sense to change something like for example, when you're going through a process step by step, clicking next, next, next. But then if one of those nexts is the one that actually like finalizes the purchase, maybe it shouldn't look like the other next buttons,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you know? But to do it, to trick somebody is a dark pattern. Like, well, no, we're not gonna, oh, it's consistent. It's the same next button, but now this one actually takes your money and you can't get it back, or whatever,
Yeah.
like you want to make it different
Mm-hmm.
in order to convey some different meaning, or you need to change it because now that it's another, and I'll stop with this, I promise. But like you've seen these optical illusions where you can put red in the middle of like a green field behind it, and then you see the same color over here behind like a yellow or something, and it looks like a different color.
Mm-hmm.
Like in order to make it look like that other red, you actually have to change that color so that they're both the same red, right? So in order to be consistent, you actually have to create inconsistency because the way I'm perceiving and experiencing it is not necessarily the context changes what it means to me.
Sure. So the example of the next button, that's what I mean. If you had a next button and then the submit button, is the same color, or submit payment button looks exactly the same. Like
Mm-hmm.
it probably would be better to, change the color, add an extra icon or something like that so that it's really clear that, okay, now
Mm-hmm.
you're doing something different than just clicking next through a process. So on the flip side of shapeshifters, we talk about masked objects. And a masked object, you could go down to the UI level. That would be, I would say, if you went next, 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 submit, and you made the submit button look exactly like the next button, I would call that like a
Mm.
masked component or something like that. But a masked
What's that word?
mask, like
M-A-S-K,
I'm
M-A,
wearing a mask.
masked. Okay,
Masks.
gotcha.
So that would be
Masking.
where, and Amazon has a great example that I give all the time of like their tiles on their homepage. They like have in their design system, they have a homepage tile. And
Mm-hmm.
anything can go in it. Like a product can go in it, a category can go in it, a brand can go in it, a service can go in it. And what
Right.
happens is you have a lot of different objects wearing the exact same outfit. And then you mix that
Mm-hmm.
up with shapeshifters where you have the same object that wears a lot of different outfits.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
creates a lot of confusion. But like the Xbox example, like did they have it the exact same color as everything else?
I can't remember the details. I remember it was similar enough
Yeah.
that people, it bugged people, but it
Yeah.
was like, yeah, but it's working.
Right.
So what's the problem, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I was of two minds of it at the time, but it's just it's an old example of how you could go to a library and some of the books aren't going to be in the stacks. They're going to have particular popular books on a table out front.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that breaks the system. Well, no, I mean, they still have the Dewey Decimal Code on them.
Mm-hmm.
You could go put them back on a shelf if you wanted to, but we put them out here because it's serving the needs in the moment, right? And then nobody questions that
Right.
anymore.
But there's a because there. And that goes back to that hidden rules. Like, why are these books out here? Which is kind of a funny question. I don't think it's, making anybody's brain explode at Barnes and Noble or anything. But like, usually there's a label. Like, these are out here because these are
Yeah.
staff
Oh yeah.
picks, or these are
Sure.
out here because they're bestsellers, or these are out here because they're clearance. Now, I would think that if I saw at a bookstore and I saw some books that were sort of displayed differently, but there was no label on it, like, why are these being displayed differently? I might have
Mhm.
pause for a moment and think, okay, what makes
Would you
these
though,
special?
or would you just walk into a bookstore and whatever it is that you're looking for, you're heading that way, but there's a cool title on a book on this table right in front of the door I just walked through. I'm curious about that book. You know what I mean? Like in the environment, like we're drawn to the things that catch our interest.
Mm-hmm.
We might later think about why was that there.
Yeah.
But like like that's part of what is so key to this whole way of thinking is getting when we look at something in retrospect, we want to bring a rational kind of framework to it. But in the moment of action and perception, we're not really processing all that so much as users. If something that we are interested in just happens to be in front of us, we're not going to go, but wait, what was the
But
rule?
we
What
do.
was their rationale?
We do. I mean, you gave the example of the Instagram algorithm changing. So for forever, I think you gave that example, or maybe I just thought of that example as I was reading your book, was like when the algorithm changed, when they brought in the algorithm, and it was a timeline for so long and it was
Yeah.
chronological for so long. And all of a sudden things were at the top that I didn't know
Well, that
why
was
they
just
were at the top. And I still don't
yeah,
know
but
why
that
they're at the
was
top.
no, exactly. Well, that's different. Like that was a disruption in a fundamental
Mm-hmm.
structure. That's like if I walked into a bookstore and the books were on the ceiling or something. I mean, that's not quite the analog, but like that was a fundamental architectural change that really changed the reality of what the space was.
Mm-hmm.
It changed the way I comprehend what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
And now or to the point of like, I mean, it used to be if I posted something on like Instagram, I knew that if people who follow me logged in and happened to scroll far enough, they would see it. I'm not even assured of that anymore
Right.
because it's only showing things that the algorithm thinks are going to be of interest sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's prioritizing for me in ways I don't understand. And I think that's really different from a thing just happened to be at hand that I needed, and I'm not necessarily going to ask why. Now I've actually been surprised though at how many people aren't bothered by the timeline getting scrambled on their social media experiences.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of people who are fine with it, but so
Well,
anyway,
let's come back to the
yeah,
fundamental question of when we have hidden rules, when there are hidden rules on why something is shifting around, or like why this piece of metadata is moved up, like why the structure of something changes, or why some things are in some placement and some things are in other placement. What is our responsibility as UX designers to communicate that to the user? And does it just depend on the
yeah.
situation?
So I think the first responsibility is to not just design things in isolation, but to think of them as part of a system,
Mm-hmm.
and think of that as system as an environment. And I keep stressing that word environment because it brings us back to an embodied way of thinking about it, right? It's not just digital stuff. It's a simulation of an environment that we use in an environmental way. And so as a system, is it behaving in coherent ways, right? In terms of the way the human experiences it, okay? Is it making sense to the human? Not necessarily making sense in a scientific, purely logical, like Excel spreadsheet kind of a way, but in the moment of action and
Mm-hmm.
perception, is it making sense to the people in that environment, given the other things that are in view, or the things they did in the last step and then the next step, right? Is it making sense? And making sense is a messier question than is it the same in some sort of objective way across every instance.
Mm-hmm.
And that starts getting into the place object thing that you were mentioning earlier that you wanted to touch on. So
I did want to
um
touch on that, but I'm kind
yeah,
of thinking like we should just like bite the bullet and talk about permissions.
okay,
because because
well, that's a similar issue, yeah.
yeah, and so when in the process that I teach, so I call it the ORCA process, and that stands for objects, relationships, calls to action,
Hmm.
and attributes. And this idea that like if somebody enters an environment, to be able to really nicely understand that environment and get stuff done in that environment, they basically are like, what are the things here? How do all the things relate to each other in context in this particular environment? What can I do? What are the affordances of these digital things that I can't actually touch? And what are their attributes? What is the structure? What's the chemical makeup of these things? And these things, those are questions that just the back of our brain answers very easily in a physical environment. Even for those that have visual impairment, they have ways to figure out the answers to those questions without barely even thinking about it. We have evolved to easily answer these questions. And then we go into digital environments and it's hard. If I had if there was a fifth question and those four fundamental questions, it would be, who am I in this environment? And we have, and you talk about it with your, with travel experiences and being at the airport and like, who am I? Am I silver medallion? Am I sky priority? Like, am I TSA pre-check? Am I all those things? How do they overlap? But like, what I think is like the biggest challenge for designers, and this is one thing that I hear all the time. Oh, got to plug in battery, is problems with designing for permissions. And like, the more we are getting immersed in these environments and like working in these environments, permissions are just getting crazier and crazier. I mean, even Zoom has a problem. But like, what I think is interesting about permissions is like, I can have, like, to take an ed tech example, like I can be teacher, student, principal in this environment, but then I have permissions based on my relationship to different objects. So like, can I, like, the things that I could potentially do to students as a teacher in this environment depends on if they are in a class that I teach. So it's like the teacher's relationship to the class, and then the class's relationship to the student determines the teacher's ability to take action on individual students.
Right.
And then you might have, you have a lesson, and this teacher is the creator of this lesson, and this teacher is a collaborator on this lesson, and this other teacher is a viewer of this lesson. Yeah. So like, how do you have any good ways for UX designers to pull this apart in their head and design for situations like this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's like a one simple trick kind of thing, but really the one simple trick is coming back to the human who you're putting into an environment. Is the environment legible? Is it making sense? Okay. And that has to do with his behaviors too. So if I'm looking at something in one place here's an example from some years back. I haven't used Basecamp in forever, but some years back in another job, we used it a lot. And it was frustrating. I realized at one moment that somebody was saying, "Oh, well, you can." I forget what the exact situation, but basically it was I needed to know some other people who were in that Basecamp instance, and in order to include them in some other thing. And I was told, "Oh, just go to XYZ and you can see all the people." And I tried that. I was like, there was no that for me. There was no way for me to do that. And then it came to find out, well, no, they could do it because they were an administrator.
Yep.
As an end user, I had no way to see everybody who was a part of that. I forget the entity. It was company or whatever. But anyway, I was in a silo that I couldn't get out of to see that view, right? But there was nothing to tell me that.
Yeah.
Because the people who made the application were all administrators.
And there was nothing to tell the administrators that you couldn't see it either.
Right. But they didn't need information architects at Basecamp. That was the thing he said years ago that still annoys me. But so the answer is you have to think about who are the participants in the environment and what are the rules that constrain or shape the environment for them. And then you got to start thinking about the fact that you're creating multiple environments that have overlaps. And they have to make sense to all those people. So when you're doing a sitemap, don't just do one sitemap. Do a sitemap that reflect or a flavor of it that reflects what the world looks like to the different variant of creature that's living in it. That doesn't have maybe some colors in its spectrum that it can see. Right? Some things are invisible to it. Well, is it still going to make sense to them or not? How do they know what cause and effect they can participate in that environment versus not? Like, they may be able to see some things, but they can't change or edit them or share them. It could be that there's things that are hidden from them, but that maybe they need some signifier to say, you can't see this right now, because maybe you know as a designer that they're going to be collaborating with somebody else who can see that thing. This is an issue in CRM and things like that, right? Where you're having to figure out, the person on the phone for customer support, are they seeing the same thing I'm seeing on the website, or are they seeing a different version of that information that's in like Salesforce or something? Like I can be looking at my user profile on my bank website and I call them, they can see my profile, but it's completely different instantiation with all kinds of other stuff in it. They don't know what I'm looking at. So you have to play through the embodied reality of how are people using this, and is it still going to make sense? Not just on graph paper, but like with humans actually trying to do things in real time.
And I mean, that example, I'll give the example of what I ran into just shopping at Home Depot or something, and like what I was looking at online, and when I called into the store, what they were looking at, like we had completely different attributes, we had completely different views of this product. And it actually made the conversation a lot more difficult. And I think, I mean, I kind of err on the side of like over communication to the user, even if it might clutter. I think we get a lot of like visual design folks not wanting to clutter up the interface, and to be able to see like, okay, here's this kind of canonical view of this thing. Now, this is something like, so that the customer service person could basically look at what I'm looking at, but see the extra information that they see, and it being clear, like a little lock icon or something like that says, this is stuff that you're seeing that the end user isn't seeing.
And I participated in that kind of design before. And I mean, the company I used to work with, there was things that were in red that the customer support person saw, that they knew, oh, these are things that the end user isn't going to see. But yeah, I mean, overall, like that's the answer I end up giving over and over again, whether we're talking about interacting with AI or anything else, comes back to there's a human being who is in a body doing things in real time in a real place. What is making sense to them or not, right? My answer to what to do from a design perspective would be, as soon as you feel like you're starting to need to add a lot of gloss or annotations to things to try to explain them to people, it's a flag. It isn't that you should never do it, but it is a flag, I think, to step back and go, wait, is there a structural way to make this more clear without having to explain it, without having to explain the joke, basically, right?
Yeah.
And if not structural, meaning like just the way things are situated against one another and the way they're structured on the page or in the view, is there some other signifier, some other nuance of signifier I can add to add some clarity to this, right? To indicate like there's something different here going on or whatever. That I can learn, that can be consistent enough or to where like, okay, now that's a part of the system I've learned as a user, that this instance of this thing is a little bit different and behaves differently than these other things. And if that can't do the trick, then add instructions, help, whatever. But like, but it also raises the question is, do you need that complication, or are you better off without it? Are you adding a feature, or are you coming in and kind of crashing in with a new thing that you're bolting on that's kind of scrambling what was coherent?
Yeah.
Right. Can you make it compatible with what was already there, so you're not breaking the coherence that you already had?
100%. So in our last minute here, is there a next book coming out? Are you working on anything?
No, the very thought of it frightens me.
No, that's not the answer I wanted.
And honestly, when I think about another book, I think, is there a way I could write this book better? Because when I was writing it, I was trying to figure out and learn that stuff as I was going. And I think there's a lot of imperfections and a lot of extra in it that I didn't need in retrospect. So I have thought about, is there a digest-y kind of way to convey these things?
I think that we need understanding context for dummies. Whenever I recommend the book, I just preface it. I just say there are certain places you're just going to want to read them over and over again. I mean, I've read the book 3 times and I still get new stuff out of it. It is dense, and I say that as a compliment. But it would be great to have like the 120-page version of it. That would be. I would.
Yeah. No, I would love to do that. I would not love to write it, but I would love for it to exist. So the question is, how do I get from A to Z? I don't know, but I'm thinking, I mean, I'll tell you, I have a folder on my phone in my notes app where I keep running across other things related to this, and I have to capture them because I'm like, I may want to come back to this at some point. So who knows, it may add up into something.
Well, I hope you do. I'll be on the pre-order list for that one.
Awesome.
Andrew, my dear, thank
This
you
was
so
great.
much. Thank you. We got through about 30% of the questions, so I will follow up in like 6 months or something, maybe to have another conversation with you. But thank you.
No problem. I actually made a lot of notes based on your kind of pre-questions. I'm going to email this to you, and then maybe that'll help something too.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Awesome. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit objectorientedux.com/podcast for show notes. Our soundtrack is Fighter by Ruby Bell, courtesy of Sugaroo Records. Happy OUXing!